afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're excited to share our second webinar in the Maximizing Federal Investments in Young Children webinar series. I'm Jen Bender with the BUILD Initiative, and I'm handling the logistics on today's call. Audio for today's webinar is being broadcast through your computer speakers. Please ensure your speakers are turned to a comfortable volume. If you have any questions or comments throughout the session, please type them into the chat box. The presenters will monitor the chat and provide responses as they are able. This webinar is being recorded. Tomorrow morning you will receive an email with a link to the webinar recording and the PowerPoint. And with that, I'll turn it over to Harriet Dichter.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our second series where we're taking a look at federal investments for young children. Our focus today is some of our learning from Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge. As we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone who's joined us today about BUILD's mission. BUILD's mission is really was founded to be able to work in the states, and with the idea that systems in the state, that means the infrastructure, the programs, policies, and services are really essential to getting better outcomes for young children and their families. And BUILD has, as a result, a view that it's not enough to focus on services, but that we have to do more as a whole system if we really want to do well by our children and bring together the best of our public and private resources. For today's webinar, we're joined by several really great leaders in early childhood, each of whom brings different perspectives and experiences to bear on today's conversation. We join together for today's webinar to share what we see as the big picture of systems building and support for children that have come from the Federal Early Learning Challenge. We do have some hard questions that we've posed and asked each other, some of which are at the very end of our presentation and discussion with you. So we hope that people are able to stay on for the full hour and a half. Our goal today is to help us understand what states, children, and those working in early childhood got from the challenge, to help us better connect the dots between systems building and our commitments to better and more equitable outcomes for children, and to remind all of us that whatever our day-to-day work is, that we must continue to ask how it fits into the bigger picture. And as we get going, I also want to give a special thanks and shout out to the Irving Harris Foundation for supporting this work from the moment the Early Learning Challenge was first mentioned and continuing on today. We are joined by really great leaders in the field today, each of whom brings different perspectives and experiences to bear on the conversation. I'm going to do them in the order that you can see everybody's picture up on the screen. Kristen is a very engaged leader from Georgia. She brings a lot of shrewd talent to her job focusing on systems as part of the Georgia State Early Childhood Agency. She has been involved in the creation of Georgia's systems work under the challenge from the get-go of that project. Cynthia Tate has a long and distinguished history of service to children and families, but is new to her job in the governor's office in Illinois. So she is looking with fresh eyes at where Illinois is and will frame her remarks about Illinois and the Early Learning Challenge from that vantage point. Susan Hibbard is the Executive Director of BUILD, and my guess is that most everyone on this call has heard her talk before. She is an exceptionally good thinker and very good at helping people challenge their own assumptions and seeing alternative ways of meeting needs in early childhood. And our last speaker today will be joining us is Valora Washington, who I think most of you know is one of our field's great leaders. And while her current focus is on innovation for the CDA system, she has served in multiple roles through philanthropy and the nonprofit sector and brings this breadth into the conversation. And of course, this is Harriet Dichter speaking. I'm your moderator, and I've been able to work on these issues we're talking about today as an appointed leader for 2 governors as well as at the city level and as an advocate as well. We are going to get started with today's conversation with some pretty short overviews, first from Kristen talking about Georgia, and then from Cynthia talking about Illinois. And after we've had these high-level overviews from Kristen and Cynthia, we then have a set of questions that we are kind of asking and answering each other that we'll move into so that we'll be able to hear from everyone on the panel. So I'd like to get us going by turning things over to Kristen. It's all yours.
Thank you, Harriet, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to see on the participant list many of those folks who have been on our Georgia Race to the Top team, and just have to thank them from the start about what I'm about to talk about. It's hard to distill $51.7 million and 4 years worth of work into 4 slides, but I'm going to do my best and start with what we did in Georgia. As we're kind of in this closeout phase as we enter into our last year of the grant, as I reflect back on what we've accomplished, to me it focuses in these 4 large buckets. The first, which is kind of the focus of this webinar, is thinking about delivery structures and systems. And when I think about 2 of the accomplishments we've seen through Race to the Top, we did a pilot around delivery of child care subsidy with Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge dollars, piloting a grant-based model rather than a certificate-based model. That has proved particularly timely, as now we're preparing to scale that model with CCDF funds. We also switched the way our child care resource and referral agencies offered technical assistance to programs pursuing a star rating in our QRIS, which we call Quality Rated in Georgia. We moved to a set of performance-based contract measures for them, which really changed the way they did their jobs and the way programs experienced technical assistance through the Quality Rated process. That leads right into the next big bucket, which about half of our Early Learning Challenge was spent on drastically and dramatically increasing participation and rating numbers in our QRIS in Georgia. I think important to that, though, was also thinking about how we changed the way we talk about it and the supporters we engaged. We moved from having only a couple hundred rated programs to almost 1,500. We have almost 40% of our child care providers in Georgia now have a star rating. And that's critical, and I think that's the output of things like how we increased our provider and family-facing communication and revised ways we did that, and also raised about $14 million in private philanthropic funds to support implementation by providing bonus packages to providers. Race to the Top was the key for us to leverage that additional funding. Another enduring legacy of Race to the Top for us will be the development of our kindergarten entry assessment in Georgia. And while that's certainly not unique, and many states have now developed a KEA of some kind, I'm particularly proud of the website we built to help support family-based communication on what the readiness check results mean, and also what families can do at home to better support their children. And finally, I think our investments in IT infrastructure will probably be our greatest enduring legacy of Race to the Top. I think this is a huge lesson learned for us, which I'll get into later, but these are the systems that will remain and be maintained after this one-time grant funding is gone. Specifically, our cross-agency child data system, which in Georgia is what we call our ESIS, our Early Childhood Integrated Data System, and now has a public-facing website and has fully matched child-level data. You can click on the link there and play around with it if you'd like. We've built a new professional development system for our early childhood education teachers. That Quality Rated subsidy grant project that I mentioned about pursuing a grant or contract-based model for subsidy instead of certificate also is being supported by back-end IT infrastructure upgrades and updates. And then we changed the way families search for childcare and also the way providers offer information about their programs. You can see the public-facing version of that portal at qualityrated.org. So when I reflect on it, these 4 large buckets were our key accomplishments during the Race to the Top period. But the fun part, now we get to reflect back on what we learned. So I think we learned that you really should only use systems funding to build things that you have a funding mechanism to maintain, as well as a delivery mechanism to sustain. I think we're learning that with our Quality Rated subsidy grants. We were very intentional about the way we piloted those funds, and we believe that with CCDF funding, we'll be able to maintain them and grow them. The second big lesson, I think, with a systems-level grant is that it's not just thinking about state systems, but also thinking about community and local-level systems. And like many states, Georgia had a zone-based effort that we called Early Education Empowerment Zones, which I'll talk more about later. We came to the table, I think, assuming that we would be welcome partners from Atlanta and every corner of Georgia, and that people would be jumping over themselves to work with us on these key projects. what we learned is that oftentimes the state was more of an albatross around our neck than a welcome partner. We had to work hard to get around that title and around that label and what that meant. But we found that with consistency, we did develop really critical relationships with local partners that are now being used for a variety of projects, initiatives, and things that support children and families. But what did we unlearn? Perhaps this is more important. What were not the new things that were brought to us, but what were those practices that we had to really stop tying ourselves to or stop saying that they were the only way to be done? I think the first thing that I think about is also from those early education empowerment zones, which was that funding was not the most important ingredient to bring community partners to the table for young children. I think sometimes coming from the state, we assume we can only engage with local or community-based partners if we have a grant opportunity to dangle in front of them. That is definitely not the case. And many of you on the phone are probably nodding your heads in agreement because you already knew this. And we definitely had to unlearn just that funding is the magic ingredient. Our birth to 18s are what we call the leadership structures for each of these early education empowerment zones. And what's been amazing to me is to watch the partners that have been engaged in this at the local level, the amount of additional funding and resources that they've brought to the table completely outside of the grant we promised. Of course, the players also never stay the same, and that leads into the final thing we had to unlearn, which was don't assume that once you've gotten buy-in once that you're set for the next 4 years. We began the work on our cross-agency child data system by getting data sharing agreements settled with all of our participating state agencies. It's been about 2 years actually building out the IT infrastructure for the system. When we came back to try and develop the governance rules and really think about how we wanted to use it, surprise, all the players had changed. We should have done a better job from the beginning, keeping all of the groups updated and engaged in our work. So we definitely had to unlearn that once you get buy-in once, you're set. What did we relearn? And I think these are the things, again, where if you've been in this work for a while, you've had to experience all of them, but it's always good to have a reminder. First thing is communicate, communicate, communicate. As early as often, repeatedly, in as many forms, in as many mediums, and to as many audiences as possible. For us, this actually turned into using Early Learning Challenge funding to hire a full-time person whose job it was to manage our communication and outreach strategy. We kind of assumed because we had made a place on our website for the information to live that everyone would go there and have all their questions answered. That every grant we published that was a sub-grant of the ELC would have many applicants, and just putting it out there on our website would be enough. And we quickly learned that that was not the case. Facebook pages don't update themselves. Content experts aren't the best at writing newsletter articles. Make it someone's job. I think it's always good to remind ourselves, too, that we need to look into the rule, law, or statute to show us where it can't be done. The beautiful thing about ELC is it gave us the opportunity to innovate. And I think in Georgia, we really had to look and say, are we doing it that way because it's always been done that way or because it can only be done that way? And more often than not, it was the first. And finally, with any grant, things sound great when you're writing them at 2 a.m. in the morning around a conference room table in the middle of the night. When you actually get to implementation, you find some surprises. So the picture here on this slide is of a Clark County, Georgia fire station. In our Early Learning Challenge grant, we said we would run home visiting out of child care centers, and we would offer them as a family support to families who receive subsidy in child care programs around the state. The thing we didn't realize is that child care programs don't have a whole lot of extra space to do things like that. And so for those family screenings, the child care center office space would not work. And so one of our child care partners actually had to develop a partnership with the fire station across the road so that those family screenings could take place in their community resource room there. So sometimes, yes, a fire station works when a child care center won't.
Thank you, Kristen. That was a great overview of Georgia. So we're now going to turn to Illinois and hear a little bit from Cynthia to talk about her perspectives on the Early Learning Challenge. Cynthia, take it away.
Thank you, Harriet. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about this. As Harriet mentioned, I'm 1 year in this position, and so Race to the Top was in full swing and actually winding down when I came into the position. And so I have a perspective that is a little bit different. And so I'll just refer back to what I have understood from the material that I've reviewed and the staff that were still here when I came. I have to give a lot of credit, all the credit, to the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge staff that was here that actually did this work and onboarded me and helped me to understand what it is that they had accomplished. And so what they were trying to solve, the problems they were trying to solve in the system when they started were the, children with high needs having access to most effective services. That was not the case previously. It felt that parents needed a way to determine the relative quality of various group early childhood settings. So part of the reason was around a parent's guide to selection. That programs need systemic support for continuous quality improvement. And I'm sure that I know I'm going to mention that in a later slide, but that continues to be the case. That the early childhood workforce needs preparation and ongoing support for professional development. That continues to be the case as well. And that the state needs information to understand the effectiveness of its investments in early childhood. And that's really referring to sort of the condition of our multiple data systems to be able to describe what's going on in the early childhood system, from the workforce to the kids to the programs. The data systems were very fragmented, and so part of what the Race to the Top was trying to accomplish was some work in that area as well. So what we did, well, we invested a good deal of the $52 million in the QRIS, which for us is called ExceleRate. And ExceleRate actually is a rating system built on the circles of quality. And so the very bottom, of course, is to be licensed. And then we have the bronze level, the silver level, and the gold level. And then we also awarded awards of excellence for programs who went beyond the requirements for even the gold level. But to do ExceleRate, we invested in quality specialists who worked with the programs to help them meet the criteria for the various circles of quality for which they were applying. We invested money in training and development, both online and in-person training in English and in Spanish. We enhanced quality supports for program improvement, and those supports were on the site in the way of coaching and other kinds of hands-on face-to-face quality supports that were provided. Programs received incentives for participation in the quality rating system, and we also funded the QRIS validation study through these dollars. The validation study actually is just finished, and so we're going to be hearing what that has to say actually next week. We provided funding for assessment at the program level for public awareness, which was really key and critical, and actually continues to be. The messaging about why quality is important, I think, is messaging that you just have to continue to provide that messaging for folks who are participating in the system and want to know why. Why does it make a difference? We're asked this all the time. This is expensive, it's hard to do, why does it make a difference? And so your public awareness and your messaging continue to be really important. And the rest of the infrastructure that we developed to support ExceleRate. We also did data integration projects and funded, Illinois got a Illinois longitudinal data system, and we supported, through Race to the Top, the early childhood matching component of the ILDS, which will allow us, and we're really excited to see this data coming out. It'll allow us to track and find individual kids through different programs, and we can see where children are being served by multiple programs as well, which is a very, very important point to make when you're doing system building, that children aren't just in one system or another, that they are in multiple systems. And also integrating data from our Gateways credentialing system with our data systems that are a part of our higher education systems as well. So the workforce data, I think I kind of already went to this, the Gateways to Opportunity Credentialing System. We've got some projects that are going on with higher ed, community colleges, and four-year schools around alignment for those career pathways. And we gave out a number of scholarships and continue to give out scholarships until the money runs out. We funded community systems development. We had 11 innovation zones in high-need communities, and I'll talk a little bit about those shortly. It funded also coordination alignment. So OECD is the office that I had, is the Office of Early Childhood Development. The Early Learning Council, which is our governance structure, and projects that promoted integration. And we also provided support for our kindergarten entry assessment, which is launching sort of as we speak. So we are in sort of spin down mode at the moment, and reflecting on what the challenges were and what the strengths are. Absolutely, establishing ExceleRate was tremendous. We have 2,329 programs that are participating in ExceleRate, and that's just very, very significant in terms of what it means for the quality of early care and education in Illinois. The Gateways to Opportunity Credentialing System is still supported and provides not only the credentialing system, and the trainings as well, and administers our scholarships. So Gateways is important. The data system enhancements that I mentioned a minute ago, and the community systems development work, which we continue to do under our preschool development grant, aligning innovation zones with our PFA expansion areas, and then of course kids. Our challenges are not a few, as you can see. We have a number of challenges. Continued support for ExceleRate is a very big challenge, and that includes the quality add-ons in terms of the tiered reimbursement that was established. We are a state that had no budget for 2 years, and so we have some extremely serious fiscal constraints, and so we are really challenged to maintain our quality specialists, our quality monitoring activities, our incentives, the participation in awards for excellence, for the coaching that went with that, and all forms of professional development. It remains a challenge. The QRIS system updates and revisions based on the validation study are yet to be articulated, but we will have to find funding to support making those updates and those revisions. We would love to continue to do scholarships. We have included as much as we can in scholarship money. We're funding cohorts, which we find to be really effective ways to move people from very entry-level positions in the workforce up through community college and higher ed, and we would love to be able to continue to support cohorts and reduce cost credentials. The 2- and 4-year higher ed alignment work through the EPI grants that we had was really significant. That work continues in the translation of curriculum into benchmarks that correlate with our credential system, continues to go on and needs to be supported, as well as the completion of the data matching that I mentioned before in the ILDS, and all of the work that was done in community systems development.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. So what we thought we'd do next is briefly just 2 more sets of things from Kristen and Cynthia, because both states had these innovation or transformation zones. And so we wanted to ask Georgia and Illinois to help us to see what was better as a result of this kind of focused strategy? And Kristen's going to go first and talk about Georgia.
Great, thank you, Harriet. So in Georgia, we picked 4 early education empowerment zones, or E3Zs, and as we called them, they were picked because they were both high need and high capacity, meaning that we selected a potential set of 11 zones based on data that we could easily collect regarding child care availability and access, child and adult poverty, high school graduation rates, low birth weight babies, basically any risk factor you could think of for a community, but then went and visited and met with community leaders in all 11 locations and picked the 4 that were most interested in working with us. So we were really going out to see what was their capacity and interest in partnering with us. What we realized was that the infrastructure of the E3Zs became critical to a lot of our work in both Race to the Top and beyond. I'll start actually with the final bullet, and what this really gave us was this direct access to known local partners, that we ended up knowing teams of people very well at the State Department of Early Care and Learning and across our participating state agency partners, so that as the new initiatives came about, or as we needed to do focus groups or test new concepts, we went back to these communities over and over again with many things that were never thought of in our initial application. That also leads into the second bullet, going in reverse, which is that almost $1 million additional dollars were spent in these zones beyond what was called for in our initial application. This was the result of these community partners that came together with their leadership and applied for other state, federal, and local funds to support their work. And finally, the greatest impact of this work has been the percentage of children who receive child care subsidy in these zones in programs that are rated and quality rated. Here you can see an example of where our 4 zones were in the gray when they started at the beginning of the Early Learning Challenge grant and where they are today. To give you some context, about statewide today, 40% of all child care subsidy certificates are in programs that are rated. But this is a really important data point to us in Georgia right now, as we've recently set a deadline that by the end of the calendar year of 2020, all child care subsidy certificates will need to be in rated programs if they're in licensed child care. So as you can imagine, with drastic gains like we saw in these 4 zones, we're going to them now again and again to look at intentionally what worked, what can we bring to scale, what do we need to go to other communities to replicate to see these types of gains across Georgia.
Thanks, Kristen. Let's hear a little bit from Cynthia about what some of the benefits were for children and families and community in Illinois from these zones.
Sure. So again, we had 11 innovation zones, and they had 2 primary purposes when they were established. One was to enroll and serve more children from priority populations in the early learning programs, and the second was to increase the number of programs participating in ExceleRate. So what we did find out is that we did help families enroll children more easily, and enrollment in programs and innovation zones did increase. We had some innovation zones who especially targeted developmental screenings, which we found some innovation zones really had very, very low levels of developmental screening, and we knew that there are many, many more children in those areas that needed early intervention and other developmental services. So they targeted developmental screening and did campaigns to really help families receive those services, and those were very successful. Really raised the awareness of early learning and development programs. The zones explored a wide range of family and community outreach strategies and really had a real focus on family engagement and became very creative with family engagement activities, and particularly those that were targeted to the changing demographic of various communities around Illinois. And the innovation zones fostered some new partnerships and expanded existing ones with both traditional and non-traditional partners, and became very active in each of their communities with partners who wouldn't already be considered part of an early childhood collaborative. Maybe they would be healthcare partners, or they were other kinds of partners depending on the needs of the children and the families in those areas. And so those collaborations, we've been visiting the zones since the new staff have arrived, including myself. And we find that the folks in those innovation zones continue to work together, and they continue to reach out and enroll and to expand their partnerships.
Thank you, Cynthia. So I think what we've heard from both Georgia and Illinois is a lot of good success of really creating a close connection between local community and state, and a lot of good benefits that can accrue. Moving on, we wanted to ask everyone participating in today's call to think about their answer to this question, which is, what's the relationship of systems building to improve services and outcomes for children? Because we know that we encounter some skeptics who really say that system stuff is pretty irrelevant. Why are we doing that? So we decided to tackle that question head on. And we're going to start with Kristen in terms of some of her thinking about that, and then move to Valora.
Thank you. So I think, as I've talked about with our zone work in Georgia, for me, thinking about systems building, it also forces you, when you're engaging with community and local partners and the state simultaneously, it really forces you to think about user-centered design. When you're thinking about how do you change systems or improve them, you have to engage with the users to make sure what you're designing works for them. And I think that leads us closer to the outcomes, again, that we all want for children and families. I also think systems building brings more resources to the table, because if you're all sitting around a shared governance structure or a shared buy-in to a project, but coming from a variety of backgrounds, a variety of federal funding streams, whatever it might be, that it forces us to think more intentionally about how we use those resources, or even what new resources might be out there that we don't know about. I think better use of resource, more efficient use of resources also sells well politically, no matter if you sit at the local, state, or federal level. And then the engaged families and communities is, of course, across the board for that. If families are only reaching the system through the health lens, then early learning absolutely has to be there. If families are only engaging through the family support lens, then of course health and early childhood only benefit from partnering with that. So we all gain, we all build stronger programs and service delivery models when we think about a system-centered approach.
Thank you, Kristen. Valora, do you want to jump in here?
I will. And with the Council for Professional Recognition, because we offer the CDA, of course we engaged in with many of the states in terms of the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge. And one of the things that we saw as an advantage of the systems building is that it really helps states to begin to think about what are the many sources of data that might be out there available for them to help them think about systems building in their states. And of course, we were happy to be a partner in providing CDA-type data to many of the states. Another advantage of the systems building and how it helps improve services and outcomes for children is that we really begin to, in our relationships with states, really see a big focus on the interrelationships and how dynamic they were, so that people really began to think about that early childhood education as a whole, the entire network, is really bigger than the sum of its parts, and that we begin to see patterns of change rather than isolated single events. So we really saw that the systems building work in many states was really focusing and emphasizing the integration of the many different systems in states, and you bringing those together, particularly around issues of professional development. So you will see in both Georgia and Illinois, there was really an emphasis on professional development, and we've provided for you, just for your information, some of the kinds of data that we had in terms of looking over the period of the Early Learning Challenge grants, how CDA for example, earners increased in Georgia and Illinois. Also, the professional development specialist numbers, those are the mid and senior level early childhood educators who do verification visits of child development associate candidates, also began to increase in these states, and networks among them started forming. So the systems building work, we think, is a really important part of this conversation about professionalizing the field and building the work, thinking about it as a whole rather than as separate parts.
Thank you, Valora. Let's hear a little bit from Illinois, from Cynthia, about how systems building is connected to what we want for our kids.
Sure. So one of the first results of on-the-ground systems building is that the services then become more targeted to the particular needs of the community in which you're operating, and then therefore access is increased. We have much more collaboration among early learning professionals because of our systems building efforts, and this is true at the community level and at the state level. We have definitely stronger community connections, and as I mentioned before, more newer approaches to working with families and family engagement have been developed. We've got increased screenings and referrals. I mentioned the developmental screenings before and the referrals that are made as a result of that, and greater capacity for enrollment into all of the various kinds of programs that are offered in a particular community. Again, we have an increased focus on priority populations and the measurement with the kids' assessment.
Great. Now we're going to get to hear from Susan about her thinking about this question.
Well, I love hearing about Georgia and Illinois, and it's so great to hear the details of how it all played out on the ground and to have those shared. I think, systems building obviously is what we do and what we think is so critical to improving services and improving child outcomes in the long run. And I think a lot of it has to do with exactly what Kristen and Cynthia said, the user-centered design. The common goal needs to come from the people who are using the services or who might use the services or who you intend to be the beneficiaries. And I think if that happens, then the idea of systems building and systems building done well is that you're coordinating the leadership, financing strategically, aligning the policies and the regulations, and creating supports for improvement. So having everything move toward that same common shared goal, which is really an efficient way to work. It's a way to work that ensures that you're moving toward what people want and that you're not just thinking about one aspect, because slots without quality, doesn't work. Thinking about programs but not thinking of the adults working in them, that's just a piece of the solution. So it's really taking a holistic approach and trying to think about how all together we're better together and we can do it together. And I think these, especially the work in the innovation zones, showed how much more user-centered and how much more effective we can be when we do work together. So I think, the focus of systems also obviously includes an enormous focus on data and measurement so that we know what the impact is, and it's not just good intentions, but that we're actually getting someplace.
Great. Thank you, Susan. We now want to move on to kind of continue some more of this discussion about the importance of systems building, and I've asked each of our speakers to share with us where they think we should be heading in terms of our ECE systems building. And Valora volunteered, or I volunteered her to go first.
Yes, thank you. There are so many efforts and initiatives going on right now around systems building, and a lot of it is categorized under the heading of how do we professionalize the field. I think it's really important as we move forward with the lessons learned from the race to the top is really to think together about what the guiding principles are for change that we would really like to see. What principles should govern change and the people that are leading such change? There's no pre-existing answers to how to do this work, but there are some principles that I think we agree on. We all agree about the importance of engaging families, of focusing on the workforce. We know that we have to make tough choices and the funding is limited. So how do we balance all of these priorities and have the respectful listening with the families and the people in the field? This is, I think, in terms of ECE systems building, I think it would be very helpful for us collectively to step back and think about those lessons learned and the principles that we want to guide us. Whatever we do, we've got to give some really serious attention to equity issues. And although the field, I think, has worked to shift thinking about children from a deficit to a strengths approach, I think still too many times we still have a deficit approach when it comes to thinking about the workforce itself. We've got to build in issues of compensation, really look seriously at the opportunity gaps for our children and families, but also for our workforce, and I think emphasizing the results that we want to achieve, not necessarily various structures that we want to achieve. So those are some ideas for continued focus on systems building.
Thanks, Flora. Cynthia's going to talk a little bit from an Illinois point of view about where we ought to be heading now in terms of our systems building.
Yes, thank you. We really have to continue to do the work to assure that we have cross-systems alignment, and that's really in all of these areas, in policy, in operations, on the ground, in professional development in particular, and I talked a little bit about some of the alignment that was going on between our credentialing system and the higher ed benchmarking. Our workforce development as a whole is really a big area. We do have a children's cabinet here in Illinois, and we have an early childhood workforce development project, which we continue to push the idea that when we talk about workforce, the child care workforce can't just think that they are a separate workforce than the pre-K workforce, that these workforces have to be looked at together. Our community systems development is so critical. I mentioned before that when we go out and visit those innovation zones, even though they're no longer being funded through Race to the Top, they're still functional, and we still understand that they are where the rubber hits the road. It's where the needs of the children and the families become most clear, and I think where we really need to spend a good deal of our time and efforts. We're going to be doing some data, some community-level data capacity building so the communities can collect and analyze their own data and determine their own needs for themselves. So that's a big area of work that I think remains ahead. Outcomes management and data collection and the alignment in those areas are really critical, and we're focusing moving forward on really building the 0 to 3 system. That includes our infant and toddler credentialing and quality improvement work, but it also includes our home visiting work and alignment of home visiting continuous quality improvement efforts. We have home visiting operating out of 3 different departments in Illinois, and if you sit down and look at the data, nobody's collecting the same data, so we're working really hard to bring some alignment of home visiting benchmarks and quality improvement together.
Thank you, Cynthia. Kristen, do you want to talk a little bit about Georgia on this topic?
Sure. So I think I could just say ditto everything Susan said, because as you'll see, this sort of second part is more discussion-based. Data, data, data. I couldn't agree more. We can't do any of the systems work if we're not building shared data systems, more lifetime data systems, more user-friendly data systems. However you're collecting data, if this is not a forefront of your systems building strategy, I think we're really missing out on the potential it can have if it's used correctly. I think also, too, we have to remember our own work. So if we've been funding these great projects, can we take elements of them and think about them in other funding sources? Or if we're creating a new grant, or if a funder has approached us to work with something on a new project, how are we continuing to embed these system lens lessons that we've learned from things like Race to the Top into these new projects, initiatives, grants, rules? I think we also have to be thinking about the children and families who fall outside our systems. I think sometimes we get so stuck focusing on an access lens and just more slots or more services that we don't really stop to think about who are the families that are falling completely outside of it, and what good is the most beautiful system if it's still not truly accessible for each and every child. I think we also have to be careful when we talk about systems building about the demands on our workforce. What can we really expect a child care teacher to do? How might we instead think about how we partner our workforces so those people who are trained in specific fields work together to achieve the outcomes we need for children and families? I think we also always come back to in Georgia a little bit about we need a consistent shared vision for our families across all of our sectors. What do we really believe families should have? What do we really believe collectively as a system, whatever that means for our children and our families? And how do we articulate that in a way that brings people to the table?
Thank you, Kristen. Susan, can you talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, and I really completely agree with how Valora started answering this question, and then Cynthia and Kristen. So I'm not going to repeat. I'll just say a couple things that I think are different or added points. I think we need to, as a field, pay a lot more attention to the relationship between where we're trying to head, our North Star, and then our goals for a particular effort and our inputs. We often have fabulous vision and goals, and then we deal with reality on the inputs and sort of think it's all going to come out in the wash. But what we're able to fund, what we're able to do, really has a huge impact on the outcomes and then on the impact of the project. And I think the impact also goes to the equity point that Valora underscored and that I think each of us have touched on. We need to know who we're reaching, what the impact is, and how that relates to what we're trying to do. And so I think that thoughtful look at what was done in the innovation zones, how that was different, can it be scaled to the state, et cetera, is really critical to know whether or not we're moving towards a more equitable early childhood system. And then just on the right, I mentioned some of the things that I think are important, thinking about the relationship between a program and its system and then all of the child and family serving systems. We are better together, and how we do that effectively and efficiently, I think we need to promote that at the state level, at the community level, and at the federal level, and then keep studying the data, learning what was done, make changes, and start again.
Thank you, Susan. So for those of you who have been looking in the chat, you can see we're having a very active little chat on the side where everyone got excited about the innovation zones, and so my proposal is going to be to the group that we just set up another session just on innovation zones, because Georgia and Illinois were not the only states to pick up this concept, and you can see that they have been able to get a lot of good stuff out of them as a contribution to kind of their systems efforts. So I just wanted to put that out there. Cynthia and Kristen did put in the chat box already the links to their evaluations. And we'll try to see if we can do a session and kind of dig deeper, because this is such an important concept. But our next set of questions that we are asking our presenters to explore really is in the here and now, which is really, what's your current priority in terms of realizing your system's vision? What are you working on at present? And so I'm going to turn to Valora to introduce this to us.
Okay, we're at the Council for Professional Recognition. We're doing a number of things to work with states as states build systems and as we think about national competencies and national standards. So we have created an entire department within the council that is really focused on partnerships and strategic alliances with the states so that we can support states in their system building, and it helps individual candidates who are trying to achieve credentials not to have to repeat information through multiple sources. So for example, making sure that state registries align with the council's requirements. We also work with a lot of universities, community colleges, and four-year colleges on articulation. So again, that supports individuals and helps to have a higher education system and a real career pathway from the CDA, associate degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, that really works for people. In addition, of course, we work with numerous national, state, and local non-governmental organizations as we build these partnerships, as well as career and technical vocational high schools. One of the things that I discovered when I came to the council was that a lot of vocational high schools were using CDA text as part of their curriculum, and so now we've created a way for them to actually earn their CDA. And one of the things that our studies are showing is that people who receive a CDA in a vocational school, they are very strongly likely to continue on to receive associate degrees and bachelor's degrees. We've even, although our program's even been going on for 6 years, we even have a few who've gotten master's degrees. They really identify with the profession so that they really see CDA as their best first step. We're trying to help build that ECE system by understanding that we have a very multilingual workforce now, a growing multilingual workforce. We will offer the CDA in any language of the world, which is our promise. So far, we've issued it with 60 languages. It's portable across states. And this very year, just in 2017 so far, we have already issued 43,000 new and renewal CDA. So it's really growing and trusted as a tool that people are using within the states. And finally, to support the systems vision, we have created what we're calling a gold standard training certification, where we are trying to address the challenge of the wide variation in professional development training, so that our gold standard training certification indicates that a training entity or college is meeting the articulation with the national standards and competencies, that they have strong business practices, and that they have great customer service for the candidates and workers who are trying to move forward with their credentials.
Thanks, Laura. Let's hear a little bit about where Georgia and Kristen are focusing their current efforts on systems vision.
So I wasn't kidding when I said data is a key part of the second half of this presentation for us in Georgia. I think, again, we are really doubling down our commitment to make sure that our IT infrastructure systems, whether it's talking about cross-agency child data systems through the ESIS lens, or the ways that child care providers are giving us data, or the way we're recording data on our workforce, it really functions to give us the real-time information we need, as well as the research information we need to better inform systems development across all the sectors. I think we're also really looking at how we might reinvigorate our existing coordinating bodies. Rather than reinvent the wheel, how do we pull groups back together who maybe had been meeting but hadn't been working on any real significant projects at the local and state level to make sure that they're being useful in achieving that coordinating role they were created to have? I'm really excited to hear that everyone wants to learn more about our zone work, because I think what we're thinking about now is how do we continue our work supporting communities with state resources and expand the reach of our zones that we create through ELC. I think one of the things we learned is that while the targeted set of grant-funded initiatives we rolled out in our ELC zones, there were a lot of community members that just weren't aware of the resources we have at the state level that we already have funding to provide to a lot of people, to anyone who wants it to some degree. And so how do we continue creating intentional feedback loops with community partners where we build resources that are more responsive to their needs, as well as making sure they know about everything we can provide to them already? I think finally our biggest one is ensuring that these lessons learned from Race to the Top are not being lost, but are being incorporated into new grants and funding opportunities, whether they're ones that sit within our Department of Early Care and Learning or ones that our partner agencies are watching. I can think of just in the last couple of months, the new CCDF research grant that has been offered from the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the new Striving Readers funding that was released by the U.S. Department of Education. Both of these have a huge opportunity to sustain and scale the lessons learned from Race to the Top, and so we want to make sure our lessons learned come out in those new funding opportunities as well.
Thanks, Kristen. Cynthia, do you want to talk a little bit more about work in Illinois around the vision going forward?
Sure, happy to. So we're focusing the work of the Early Learning Council, which is our public-private governance structure which is about 15 years old, I think, at this point, and predates Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge. But the Early Learning Council, which is comprised of a number of different committees, is focused on cross-system goals around access, integrations, alignment, data support, and quality. So all of our entire committee structure then for the Early Learning Council embodies the overall vision of the council and has its separate work in these several areas here. We're focusing on implementing some cross-systems legislation, which is really good as an impetus for cross-systems collaboration and working together. When you get a piece of legislation that actually requires that you do that, I have to say it's very helpful. And so our legislation in Illinois on suspension and expulsion is really requiring our education department to work with our licensing department and with our we have several professional development entities that are going to be involved in working on this legislation, both in terms of making sure that the standards are consistent across departments and making sure that we promote the development of early childhood mental health consultation and the use of the pyramid model, which is what Illinois has chosen to do across all our systems. We're doing some cross-systems work on developmental screening. We have a wonderful policy of no wrong door for our developmental screening. What that does is create an enormous challenge for the system to figure out who's doing them and where they are and what happens to the children who get screened and referred. And so that's a massive undertaking. Our McVie and Prevention Initiative home visiting infrastructure collaboration I alluded to a little bit earlier when I was saying that we have home visiting in several different places in Illinois. And for a start, our prevention initiative is operated out of the Illinois State Board of Education, and they offer several models of home visiting, as does McVie. And we have a collaborative, an infrastructure collaborative, to bring those systems of continuous quality improvement and benchmarking together. I think I mentioned before also we have Early Childhood Workforce Project with the Children's Cabinet, the Governor's Children's Cabinet, which is going into its second year and has a number of different accomplishments that it can be very proud of. And we're working on continued support, as I said, of community systems development through our preschool expansion grant, and also through our state dollars that are a part of our early childhood block grant.
Thanks, Cynthia. Let's turn to Susan now to hear about how BUILD is working to realize its systems vision, given that 100% of BUILD's reason for being is to work on systems issues.
So we really are a support system for state leaders like Kristen and Cynthia. They're the doers, and we're supporters and partners. And we focus on helping state leaders think systemically, really understand the inequities in the current systems, child and family serving systems, and figuring out what it would mean to commit to equity, to take the things that we want for every young child and figure out how to get there, what it means to have a plan that drives toward equity. And to act collectively, the child and family serving systems need each other and can do more together. So how can one do that in ways that actually is manageable and efficient and effective? We often, and particularly in the last couple of years, have been helping state leaders engage in equity impact analyses to understand what their plans as they're implementing, what is the impact, not just the intention, but what's the impact for different groups of young children and families, and was that where they're wanting to head. So we're very responsive. It's not a particular program or aspect of the system that we're helping people focus on, but overall how states can realize their early childhood vision, and then translating that and bringing state leaders to inform federal policy, to not just not just share the lessons of the innovation zones for the states to learn from, but to share the lessons from the innovation zones and the states, so that federal initiatives can be structured in ways that are effective. We work with partner states, but we also have a 50-state learning community that includes things like the Quality Rating and Improvement System national meeting that many of you have probably attended. We tend to work with state teams, but we also work with individuals, and we have an Equity Leaders Action Network that's about to embark on its 3rd year, and we'll start a 2nd cohort of fellows in the Equity Leaders Action Network in the following year, so 2 years from now. And those are individual county and state leaders who want to be leading in the early childhood system for equity. So it's a peer and learning network and also a sort of curriculum. We have a number of projects. The newest that we're embarking on now is focused on health equity, and it's very much just about systems building in states, but we'll be selecting states, 7 states in the overall initiative who will receive grants and support from 3 organizations, Build is one of them, to bring early learning and health better together in a state to address disparities and to promote equity. So there are a number of ways that we try to be a support system for state leaders, and we always welcome suggestions of other ways.
Thank you, Susan. We've had a lot of conversation today where people have raised equity basically as an important component of their work. And so in this section, we want to turn to hear from our speakers a little bit more about where equity fits into their systems level work and their vision. And Cynthia is going to get us started on that.
Sure. So with the help of Build and the inimitable Dr. Ray, we really just begun our work with the Early Learning Council on racial equity at our last Early Learning Council Executive Committee meeting, in which we fully were embraced by the whole council to move forward with this work. And so we have begun the process of plotting out how the council wants to actually bring the equity lens to all of the committees that I referenced before that we have, access and alignment and quality and all those committees. How do we embed an equity lens into that work? And then how do we embed an equity lens on the child, family, and community levels? How do we use an equity lens to look at our workforce work and our provider communities? The first thing we actually decided to do, I'm going to sound, Kristen, like you, is look at the data, because we want to make sure that we know what we're talking about and that we target our efforts where the data says that we should be targeting our efforts. So we will be taking a deeper dive into our data, both our data relative to kids and what systems they're in, and our providers and our workforce. We are focusing equity work also on the statewide implementation of our legislation to prevent suspension and expulsion, because we know that the racial disparity in the numbers of children who are in preschool and child care settings who are both male and children of color, particularly African American boys, really is a major piece of that whole area of suspension and expulsion. And if we're going to address it, then we're going to have to take on the issue of racial equity in that disparity as well. And then building capacity at the preschool level for programs and school-based preschool for all administrators. And so we are embarking on that project as well, doing racial equity work at the administrative level in school-based preschool.
So surprise, surprise with my first bullet. Again, I think for us, this conversation has to begin with the data. we unfortunately have to be able to remove some of the feeling away from it and start in a place of facts about who is accessing what, and begin with the data and what it shows us about our populations who are in need, who have access, to give us that window into, are we even achieving, equality, much less equity with our work, and confronting the assumptions we might have about the populations we're working with or not working with. When I think back on where we've been working on this most closely, again, I think about our cross-agency child data system in Georgia, which I shared the link again in the chat box with everyone. That is as simple as just providing participation counts in all of our early childhood programs in the state across health, early learning, and family support. But it allows you to disaggregate by racial and ethnic groups. It allows you to disaggregate by county. And I think that's really important for us here in Georgia as well. Because while I think equity across all lenses is important, I think, again, the data really forces us to look about what we call in our state sometimes the two Georgias. We have Metro Atlanta, which is fairly well-resourced, though too many families still fall through the cracks, and we have the rest of the state. And so having data about what our counties look like, where they might be further removed from a major metropolitan area, but we really need to be forcing ourselves to look at geographic equity around the state, but everything from where we offer trainings to where we have quality child care providers to where we're talking to our families when we say we're doing family focus groups or doing this user-centered design process. I think the data and the focus on geographic equity in Georgia are critical to our conversation.
Thank you, Kristen. Laura, do you want to talk about this issue within the context of your CDA work?
I will, and I think in the context of the CDA, but also in the context of current conversations that are going on around professionalizing the field, I'd like to remind people that the CDA was developed through field-wide leadership and many conversations that happened with the field's leaders and communities to really establish the competencies that we've had now in the CDA for many, many years. And so this whole equity lens is really built into the whole history and structure of the CDA. So we really focus a lot on providing specific support to people in all languages, as I mentioned, and we do make that promise to support anyone in any language, and keeping track of the data of how the linguistic diversity of who is really serving children, and in many cases connecting people in states to state resources as they contact us from the sense of their community and not necessarily even knowing who to reach out to in their states. Also, I would bring up the issue, something that we haven't mentioned a lot today, which is the whole equity thing about sectors. As you know, there's a CDA in family child care, preschool, infant toddler, and home visitor. And there are questions about how each of these are valued, especially as systems have become more and more developed. And in some states, there is some opinion that center-based care, for example, may be favored over family child care in the use of resources. So we really try to look at these kinds of communities, linguistic communities, cultural communities, geographic communities, different abilities, even thinking about remote or rural areas that we serve in Alaska, or even, as she talks about two Georgias, remote areas in a state like Georgia, and being sure that we're really reaching out to people across the board. We realize there's a lot of personal growth and social justice that comes from thinking about these equity issues with higher education, compensation, making sure people feel part of the profession. These are some of the results that people who have earned their CDA over the past 10 years have told us that they achieved as a result of getting their CDA. And with the equity issue, finally, really focusing on our impact. I think we all have good intentions, but as we're going through the process of systems building, it's really important to take time for reflection to really see what communities are being served or not served, how people can be served better, and to make sure that we are really having the impact that matches our intentions. That's that popular saying, well done is better than well said.
Thank you, Valora. Susan now has a whole complicated slide here to start to talk about some of the ways that BUILD is incorporating the racial equity work into its day-to-day supports for states and leaders.
I wasn't trying to be complicated. I just wanted to be a little bit colorful. As I mentioned a little while ago, we're focusing a lot on equity impact analyses with state leaders to understand exactly how different children in different areas from different groups are being impacted by policies. Because often we look at a problem and assume that a policy change is needed, or might assume that, when actually it's really an implementation problem or a problem of difference in terms of who is receiving the information. I mean, there's so many ways that different children and families are affected differently by policies, even when the policy is a great policy. So we've been doing that work deeply with state leaders, but we're also trying to bring ideas that help us think about how to do equity work. BUILD is thinking about this internally with staff and consultants, and we're also thinking about it with the equity leaders, the fellows, and the Equity Leaders Action Network. The slide is just showing 4 levels of change, 4 different aspects that one might think about as you work on equity. There's clearly the personal and interpersonal issues, and those always will come up in conversations of equity, and particularly racial equity, and are part of how we learn and relate to each other. And so much of learning is relationship-based, that these are important elements. Those are not the primary focus areas of BUILD, however. We're focused primarily on the institutional and structural aspects of inequity and equity. What is it from your position of authority within your institution or structurally within your system? What are the arrangements that structure opportunity, access to different kinds of opportunities? What are the aspects of an institution that relate to access to opportunities or to fairness? So those are the areas that we're focused in on and try to hone in on and provide tools to help state leaders engage in that thinking and work, and to take those tools and engage with other leaders in their state. And we have many tools and experiences to share from the last 2 years with the Equity Leaders Action Network, and we'll be doing that in the coming year, sort of going through with a number of the fellows what worked well and what we feel needs to change, but sharing those tools more publicly just so anyone might use them who wants to. But I think, I wish we could say, as Valora did, that equity was built into the DNA of BUILD from the beginning. It wasn't. We really thought that systems work and a focus on quality would in and of itself ensure equitable outcomes. And we realized pretty quickly that you could, create systems that maintained or even exacerbated the disparities that exist. And so since then, we've been working hard to include and infuse our equity focus throughout all of the systems work.
Thank you, Susan. So we were very ambitious as webinar planners, and we have many more interesting thoughts to share with you, but if we share all of them, they will definitely go beyond our designated ending time. So I'm going to ask people about this workforce question, and then just to forewarn our presenters. Then we're going to move to our question about the federal government. So this next question really has to do with the workforce and systems work. And Cynthia is going to kick us off here. Cynthia, are you still with us?
Oh my God, I was just talking. I'm sorry, I put it on mute while I was typing.
You put on mute, okay. That's a common occurrence when we're on these calls. Start at the beginning again.
All right. Our vision is for an aligned system of credentials, education, and licensure that builds a seamless pathway from entry into the workforce to the highest levels of education and licensure, and is affordable at each level of attainment. So this is embodied in our workforce project, and the issues that I think I've alluded in several of the other slides to our work in these areas as well.
So I won't repeat the first bullet point for Georgia, but I think the second one is worth mentioning as we think about a systems vision for the workforce, which is, as I sit in the Department of Early Care and Learning, obviously when I hear workforce, I think about the early childhood education workforce. I think about preschool teachers, infant teachers, family child care providers. But I think as we think about the workforce, we have to be thinking about that broader vision about who are all the workforces across those ovals of the system that are touching our youngest children. I think one of the things I'm really excited about in Georgia are how we're merging these two bullets together currently. So, for example, right now we're working on how we can build out into our professional development system, which was designed for the early childhood education workforce, opportunities for home visitors to also demonstrate their credentialing, think about how their years of experience are verified so that we can truly unite the system no matter which bucket or part of it you might be serving young children and families from.
Thank you, Kristen. Valora, do you want to talk a little bit about this since this consumes a lot of your thinking time at work?
Oh, exactly. I mean, since we are entirely focused on the workforce, I will say that our whole mission is to elevate and respect the voice of the workforce, the early childhood educator who's working with infants, toddlers, pre-K, and also in family child care. And so one of the things we want to be sure is that we're constantly asking ourselves, how do we make sure that the CDA is part of a system in the states, in the colleges, and so forth, and working with states to make sure that that happens for the benefit of our children and families and the benefit of the people who are working with our children and families. We also are striving to make sure that we understand teacher leadership and that we have to have people who are actually on a day-to-day basis working with children and families, participating in these conversations, finding these conversations relevant and meaningful to their work, and joining us as partners, as we've heard so much about Georgia and Illinois really doing that work on the ground. Asking ourselves, what about the workforce is worth preserving? One of the things of leadership is to understand what must change, but also what must be preserved. What is that DNA of our workforce and in terms of qualities, competencies, skills, and dispositions that we want to preserve as we go forward? So these are the kinds of questions that we're constantly discussing, and we're discussing with people in many states.
Thank you, Valora. I'm going to now skip us ahead. You can see as I go through these slides that we had a whole bunch of other interesting things to talk about, but I want to leave time for everyone to respond to really a question for all of us, but we're putting it specifically to each of the speakers, and that's really, what is it if people do see a continued role for the federal government around systems work to meet the needs of children and families, especially those most at risk? Where would we want to see things heading? And so we'll start with Kristen talking about Georgia and her point of view about this.
So again, data, data, data. And I think this is exactly the place where this point needs to be emphasized, because for those of you who might be calling in from states that didn't get a Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant, you might have heard about this great data work that Cynthia and I just described, thinking, well, where in the world are we ever going to get funding to do that? And I really think that data system infrastructure building is a really unique thing the federal government is well positioned to provide, to encourage, and to enhance. So I really hope as they think about where are those best opportunities to advance systems building at the state or local levels, that data systems and IT infrastructure is at the forefront of what they're thinking they can scale and sustain. One thing I hope isn't lost either is that I think it's easy for something like Race to the Top to get lost in the sea of block grants that we all spend a lot more time talking about and caring about, quite honestly. And I hope that the federal government doesn't lose these innovations that states created, and honestly that so many states created with Race to the Top. I hope they continue to push us to see what happened to those governance structures you built. What did you do with that kindergarten entry assessment you built? So as they're thinking about how they structure the rules around the large block grants that really keep our agencies funded and moving and really create the state-level infrastructure, that they don't lose sight of what they created with opportunities like Race to the Top and continue to ask questions about those in state plans and in other funding opportunities. I really hope we continue to see more jointly monitored or jointly awarded grants as well. I think one of the best things about Race to the Top from my perspective was that it was jointly funded and monitored by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Education. That helped bring my stakeholders across the state together because the funders and the monitors from all the agencies that our partners cared about were there. I didn't have to go to our education people to try and help them understand why they should care about home visiting because they knew it was the U.S. Department of Education on the other line as well. I think this adds legitimacy. I think it creates bridges. I think it really helps us think about the birth to 8 continuum. And I think that coordination we saw between HHS and ED is something I hope continues and continues in how states are supported as well. And this might be my controversial final piece is that I think, again, we can really get caught up in more slots. And while I'm never going to turn down more slots, and I think the access state has to be front and center as we think about how do we get children access to the services that we know we offer through our systems. But I think if you don't first have the investment in governance, if you don't first have the investment in systems, the access funding is lost or it's not as impactful as it could be. So I really hope we continue to see this investment first in governance, in systems, followed by access funding. I think that's the way to go.
Thank you, Kristen. Cynthia, can you talk a little bit about this from your viewpoint?
Sure, I can. And let me start by saying that I agree with Kristen on all the points that she made, and I'll just add our points on top. So first of all, continued support for QRIS implementation and refinement. Nothing is exactly perfect when you roll it out, and you have to get that feedback, which we are about to get through our validation study, and then you need to make adjustments and refinements, and I think that continued support for that, and as well as really addressing this resource gap between child care and preschool in participating in the quality improvement activities is something that we certainly could use help with. We've said many times already in this presentation how important the community systems development work is, whether it's in an innovation zone or any other kind of early childhood community-based collaborative, continued technical assistance and capacity building and at the community level is really critical. Investing in the development and implementation of best practice around family engagement for high-risk families. This is one of the big lessons learned from our innovation zone work. This is really family engagement is I like to refer to it as a content area in and of itself. And we really have to get better at family engagement, and particularly in some of our communities that are struggling right now with such issues of trust and language and just where is home going to be. It's really critical that we look at family engagement through new eyes. Providing TA and support for cross-systems data management. I think Kristen and I both continue to say the importance of data, and certainly for us, with data existing in 3 or 4 different departments, it's just a huge challenge. And so any additional support for cross-systems data management would be very, very helpful. And then to continue to fund the higher education work and competency-based assessment and the alignment of competencies with credentials. That work needs to be continued as well.
Thank you, Cynthia. How about you, Valora? What would you weigh in for the federal government to be doing?
So looking at the hour, I'm going to summarize my remarks by saying I really hope that the federal government will continue to support and promote innovation that facilitates the field's leadership, because I think as we move toward strengthening systems building, it is really going to have to be the leaders from the field that make that happen. So I hope that innovative strategies and support from the federal government will continue to do that. And at the heart of any systems building has to be that concern about the person who is really working with the child and the family every day, that person, that worker, that staff member. So I think we can really use some support from the federal government to help us think about and elevate the compensation issue and offer incentives to recruit and support and retain staff. The compensation issue is very complex, and we could use some federal support to help do that. Everyone is quite aware of the new federal study that we're hoping to receive soon in 2018, and so we'd like to see some of those recommendations implemented with support from the federal government.
Thank you, Valora. So Susan is going to close us out on this question, and then I'm going to take a half a minute to end our webinar for the day. But Susan, what's your thinking here?
Well, I love the advice that Kristen and Cynthia and Valora shared to the federal government, and I think we should say it loud and clear. I'd also like to add that I think it's important to build on what exists. Not always, but the federal government has supported many good things in early childhood, and then sometimes, as Kristen worried about the Early Learning Challenge, sometimes other things that they've supported just drop from vision or aren't continued to be looked at. The early learning councils or early childhood advisory councils, whatever you call them in your state, they're not the home of systems building in every state, but they are in many states. And so I would say to them, look at those components that you've already helped to support, and don't forget about their potential role. I think it needs to be potential because different states have developed differently. But it is, I think, a good practice and would be a very good idea if they could look at those pieces that they've helped to create and help to spur forward and think about the next steps, how each piece fits in with another. I would say the same for the kindergarten entry assessments. There was sort of a strong focus on them in the Early Learning Challenge. Then there was a U.S. Department of Education grant focused on kindergarten entry assessments. And, we're at the beginning of that. There's a lot more that needs to be done. We need to learn from what was tried. Many things are being tried right now related to kindergarten entry assessment. I think clearly there's a value, but there's a long way to go in really creating kindergarten entry assessments that are useful and effective and reliable, and I think ongoing support for that. And more generally, as Kristen said, in the infrastructure in general, the data infrastructure, the quality improvement infrastructure, professional development, higher education. The investments in infrastructure are hard to come by. They're critical. And that kind of cross-agency work that was represented by the Early Learning Challenge helps to promote those connections in states and in communities. So investing in the infrastructure needed for connections and scale and quality and equity and outcomes. I would also say, two other things, just to remember that in early childhood it's so important to support the adults who support children, whether that's the family members or the teacher or the librarian. Those adults are critical, and we can't think of young children and improving outcomes for young children without thinking about supporting the adults who are supporting them. And then I would say to the federal government that I think Benjamin Franklin was right, and that we need to keep turning our focus toward prevention. That the greater and more effective our focus on prevention is, the better off we all will be.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to all our presenters. And I want to let everyone know that we'll have a little survey going out to everybody who joined us on the call. so you can give us some feedback. I think I have some ideas about doing something on transformation zones. We will make the PowerPoint available to everyone. And again, a big thank you to everybody who took the time to call in, and especially to our speakers who spent a lot of time thinking and preparing and trying to be reflective in getting ready for the call, and I think you saw that on the call. Finally, I just wanted to let people know that our next series, our next webinar in this series is going to focus on kindergarten. And we are going to talk about the KEA, which Susan and other people referenced, basically both out of the challenge, out of the competitive federal grant opportunity, and kind of experiences of people around the country, both at the practitioner level and the systems level, thinking about those issues. So we're excited to have that opportunity. We hope that you'll register for that. It's January 28th, 2018. And we'll talk to everyone soon. And again, thank you to everyone for taking the time to share part of your afternoon with us. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.